HSST English Aspirants. What if I told you that just one of these questions could decide your rank? In the next few minutes, you'll revise 100 high-probability questions that can give you the final touch before the Kerala PSC HSST English Exam. Don't skip this. 1. Which literary period emphasized reason over imagination? Answer: Neoclassicism. 2. In literary criticism, what term denotes a hero's tragic flaw? Answer: hamartya. 3. Which narrative technique presents inner thoughts directly? Answer: stream of consciousness. 4. Which poetic device creates a pause within a line? Answer: caesura. 5. Which school of criticism focuses on class conflict? Answer: Marxism. 6. Which linguistic concept refers to language variation according to region? Answer: dialect. 7. Which literary movement celebrated emotion and nature? Answer: Romanticism. 8. Which figure of speech combines contradictory ideas? Answer: oxymoron. 9. Which criticism studies gender representation? Answer: feminism. 10. Which method prioritizes meaningful communication in ELT? Answer: communicative. 11. Which linguistic branch studies sound systems? Answer: phonology. 12. Which poetic form traditionally contains 14 lines? Answer: sonnet. 13. Which criticism questions fixed meaning in texts? Answer: deconstruction. 14. Which literary concept refers to imitation of nature? Answer: mimesis. 15. Which dramatic device reveals future events indirectly? Answer: foreshadowing. 16. Which branch studies meaning in context? Answer: pragmatics. 17. Which literary age followed the Renaissance? Answer: Restoration. 18. Which figure of speech substitutes a part for the whole? Answer: synecdoche. 19. Which language teaching method emphasizes direct exposure? Answer: direct method. 20. Which criticism analyzes unconscious motives? Answer: psychoanalysis. 21. Which poetic device repeats consonant sounds? Answer: alliteration. 22. Which literary movement rejected idealism for reality? Answer: realism. 23. Which branch studies word formation? Answer: morphology. 24. Which literary theory studies colonial power relations? Answer: postcolonialism. 25. Which dramatic form ends in catastrophe? Answer: tragedy. 26. Which linguistic term refers to socially accepted language variety? Answer: standard language. 27. Which criticism emphasizes reader interpretation? Answer: reader response. 28. Which poetic device compares unlike things indirectly? Answer: metaphor. 29. Which literary movement is associated with fragmentation? Answer: modernism. 30. Which branch studies sentence structure? Answer: syntax. 31. Which ELT method focuses on habit formation? Answer: ordolingualism. 32. Which figure of speech exaggerates intentionally? Answer: hyperbole. 33. Which literary concept means emotional purification? Answer: catharsis. 34. Which criticism studies myths and symbols? Answer: archetypalism. 35. Which literary form combines dialogue and performance? Answer: drama. 36. Which linguistic branch studies meaning relations? Answer: semantics. 37. Which movement emphasized individual imagination? Answer: romanticism. 38. Which poetic device repeats vowel sounds? Answer: assonance. 39. Which literary theory studies binary oppositions? Answer: structuralism. 40. Which method uses translation extensively? Answer: grammar translation. 41. Which dramatic device involves audience awareness unknown to characters? Answer: dramatis-irony. 42. Which criticism values close textual analysis? Answer: formalism. 43. Which poetic form mourns the dead? Answer: elegy. 44. Which linguistic phenomenon involves language mixing? Answer: code switching. 45. Which literary movement followed modernism? Answer: Postmodernism. 46. Which figure of speech gives human traits to objects? Answer: personification. 47. Which literary term means a reference to another text? Answer: allusion. 48. Which criticism examines racial identity? Answer: African criticism. 49. Which linguistic unit carries meaning? Answer: morpheme. 50. Which poetic device addresses absent persons directly? Answer: apostrophe. 51. Which dramatic form uses humor and happy ending? Answer: comedy. 52. Which branch studies language and society? Answer: sociolinguistics. 53. Which literary technique presents disrupted chronology? Answer: flashback. 54. Which criticism studies environmental representation? Answer: eco-criticism. 55. Which literary age emphasized scientific rationality? Answer: Enlightenment. 56. Which poetic device repeats initial words? Answer: anaphora. 57. Which linguistic concept refers to implied meaning? Answer: implicature. 58. Which literary movement emphasized absurdity? Answer: existentialism. 59. Which figure of speech uses understatement? Answer: light oaths. 60. Which criticism studies cultural production? Answer: cultural materialism. 61. Which literary concept refers to fate reversal? Answer: peripetia. 62. Which linguistic term refers to borrowed words? Answer: loanwords. 63. Which poetic form narrates a story? Answer: ballad. 64. Which literary movement emphasized urban alienation? Answer: modernism. 65. Which criticism studies subconscious symbolism? Answer: Freudianism. 66. Which branch studies speech sounds physically? Answer: phonetics. 67. Which literary device delays resolution intentionally? Answer: suspense. 68. Which figure of speech uses indirect naming? Answer: metonymy. 69. Which literary movement valued spontaneity? Answer: Romanticism. 70. Which criticism studies gender inequality? Answer: feminism. 71. Which linguistic concept refers to language decay in contact? Answer: attrition. 72. Which poetic device involves contradictory statements? Answer: paradox. 73. Which dramatic genre mixes tragedy and comedy? Answer: tragicomedy. 74. Which literary theory focuses on ideology? Answer: Marxism. 75. Which branch studies historical language change? Answer: philology. 76. Which poetic device creates sensory imagery? Answer: imagery. 77. Which criticism opposes author-centered meaning? Answer: post-structuralism. 78. Which literary age valued wit and satire? Answer: Augustine. 79. Which linguistic phenomenon shortens words? Answer: clipping. 80. Which figure of speech contains a hidden comparison? Answer: metaphor. 81. Which literary form is written for stage performance? Answer: play. 82. Which criticism studies textual instability? Answer: deconstruction. 83. Which poetic form praises heroes publicly? Answer: ode. 84. Which literary technique shifts narrative perspective? Answer: focalization. 85. Which linguistic term refers to speech community language norms? Answer: register. 86. Which criticism studies imperial domination? Answer: postcolonialism. 87. Which literary movement celebrated medievalism? Answer: romanticism. 88. Which figure of speech uses sound imitation? Answer: onomatopoeia. 89. Which linguistic branch studies dictionary meaning? Answer: lexicology. 90. Which literary device reveals character through speech? Answer: monologue. 91. Which criticism studies text autonomy? Answer: new criticism. 92. Which literary concept means recognition of truth? Answer: anagnorises. 93. Which poetic device repeats grammatical structures? Answer: parallelism. 94. Which ELT approach prioritizes learner interaction? Answer: task-based learning. 95. Which literary theory studies sign systems? Answer: semiotics. 96. Which linguistic concept refers to prestige language usage? Answer: standardization. 97. Which literary movement emphasized subjective reality? Answer: Impressionism. 98. Which dramatic device involves solitary speech? Answer: soliloquy. 99. Which criticism studies power through discourse? Answer: Foucauldianism. 100. Which poetic device intensifies repeated expressions? Answer: refrain.